The judge's gavel slammed down, echoing through the New Orleans courtroom. A shocking murder case, a defendant with a dark past, and a judge facing the toughest decision of her career. Katherine Monroe, renowned for her unwavering toughness and absolute fairness, thought this would be just another trial. But the moment the defendant walked in, her world tilted off balance. Daniel Carter, the man now facing the death penalty, was the same person who had once saved her life. Caught between the law and her conscience, Katherine must decide. Can she trust the justice system she has always believed in, despite its many flaws? Is Daniel truly a murderer, or just a pawn in a ruthless game of power? The truth may be buried, but it can never stay hidden forever. Don't miss this gripping story. Subscribe to Golden Story now for more thrilling tales. The sun had yet to fully rise over the New Orleans skyline. Heavy gray clouds drifted lazily across the sky, foreshadowing a gloomy day ahead. A biting early winter wind seeped through the cracks of the federal courthouse windows, where a trial unlike any other was about to unfold. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Whispered conversations rippled through the press section and the gallery. Some reporters scribbled hastily in their notebooks, while others kept their eyes fixed on the main entrance, waiting for the defendant to be brought in. This was no ordinary case. It was one of the most controversial murder trials of the year. At the center of it all, seated high on the judge's bench, was Judge Katherine Monroe. She scanned the room with a practiced gaze, taking in the expectant stares, the quiet murmurs, and the sharp suits of seasoned attorneys ready for battle. Another trial, another criminal. Justice was justice, and Katherine had always done her duty, without exception, without mercy. And yet, something about this morning felt off. She flipped through the case file on her desk, carefully reviewing the details. Defendant, Daniel Carter. Charge, murder of pawn shop owner George Miller, robbery. Evidence, surveillance footage of a tall man in a black coat seen near the crime scene. Criminal record, prior arrests for petty theft and disorderly conduct. Her breath caught when she saw the name. Daniel Carter. A strange unease settled in her chest. Where had she heard that name before? Somewhere, deep in her memory, a distant bell rang, but she couldn't quite place it. The courtroom doors swung open. Two officers escorted the defendant inside. He was tall, his wrists cuffed in front of him, moving with a quiet resignation. His expression was unreadable, not defiant, not fearful, just tired. And then, as he lifted his head, the world tilted beneath Katherine's feet. Daniel Carter. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The man standing before her wasn't just another name in a case file. He wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had saved her life years ago. A flood of memories surged forward, vivid and unstoppable. The courtroom blurred. The whispers, the shuffling papers, the harsh glare of the overhead lights. All of it melted away. She was no longer in the courthouse. She was back in the past. 14 years ago, a cold night, a fateful encounter. Katherine had been a young, ambitious law student, burning the midnight oil in pursuit of justice. That night, she had left the university library late, driving alone down a desolate New Orleans road. The streetlights cast weak, flickering halos against the empty streets. She would never forget the sound. The sudden, sickening crash. Her car skidded out of control, slamming into a streetlight with bone-jarring force. Her head snapped forward, striking the steering wheel. Everything went dark. When she came to, smoke curled from the hood of her car. Flames licked at the dashboard. She was trapped. The seatbelt wouldn't budge. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Panic clawed at her throat. The heat crept closer. The acrid smoke burned her lungs. For the first time in her life, she truly believed she was going to die. Then, a sudden yank. The door wrenched open, and a shadowy figure emerged from the smoke. A deep, urgent voice called out, "Hold on, I'll get you out." Before she could react, strong hands grabbed her, pulling her free just as the flames surged. She tumbled onto the cold pavement, gasping for air, the fire's glow flickering in her dazed vision. When she looked up, she saw him. A young man, around her age, his face smudged with soot, his piercing blue eyes filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Anger? Sadness? Determination? He studied her for a moment, then asked, "You okay?" She tried to nod, her throat too dry for words. But before she could even ask for his name, he turned away. "Wait," she called after him. He didn't stop. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air. Firefighters rushed onto the scene. But her rescuer had vanished, slipping away into the night like a ghost. She never saw him again. Until now. Katherine snapped out of the memory, her pulse hammering in her chest. She stared at the man in handcuffs. It was him. Time had changed him. His face was sharper, his expression hardened, and faint scars traced along his jawline. But she knew him. Daniel Carter. The man who had once saved her life was now standing before her, accused of murder. A lump formed in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the desk. Daniel lifted his gaze. Their eyes met. For the briefest second, something flickered in his expression, a flicker of recognition. But then he smirked, a small, fleeting smile almost mocking. Then he looked away, as if this moment meant nothing at all. No, Katherine refused to believe it. He had saved her. He couldn't be a murderer. But if he wasn't, then who was? Katherine tightened her grip around the judge's gavel, forcing herself to stay composed. She couldn't let personal emotions interfere. Not yet. Across the room, the defendant, Daniel Carter, remained silent, his head slightly bowed, his expression unreadable. It was as if he had long grown accustomed to being judged. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Gavin Brooks, the relentless district attorney known for his aggressive prosecutions, stepped forward. His sharp gaze swept across the jury before landing on Katherine. "Your Honor, we will prove beyond a doubt that the defendant, Daniel Carter, is a cold-blooded killer, a man who took a life without hesitation for just a handful of cash." His voice was steel, each word punctuated with unwavering certainty. Turning smoothly, he gestured toward the large screen positioned before the jury. "This is the security footage from the pawnshop on the night of the murder." The screen flickered to life, revealing grainy, low-quality footage. The camera, positioned high in the corner of the store, captured a tall figure in a black coat entering. The movements were quick, hurried, almost. "This," Gavin declared, pointing to the blurry figure, "is the defendant, Daniel Carter." He entered the store, argued with the victim, George Miller, and minutes later, Miller was found stabbed to death. The cash register was emptied, and not long after, police found Carter just 2 blocks away. This is no coincidence. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Katherine could feel the weight of the jury's stares on Daniel, suspicious, even hostile. But something wasn't right. She turned her attention to Madeline Grant, the defense attorney, a sharp, formidable young woman known for her ability to dismantle even the strongest cases. Madeline stood, stepping forward with an air of quiet confidence. "Mr. Brooks has presented his case with great conviction," she said, her gaze moving deliberately over the jury. "But conviction is not the same as truth." She signaled to her assistant, who placed a folder onto the defense table. "Let's examine this so-called evidence. What does this video really show? A tall man in a black coat inside a pawn shop. But do we see his face? No. Are there any fingerprints tying my client to the crime scene? No. Do we have a single eyewitness who saw Daniel Carter commit this crime?" She let the silence hang for a moment, then turned to Gavin. "Mr. Brooks, I have a simple question. Has anyone actually identified the man in this footage as Daniel Carter?" Gavin hesitated, a brief flicker of irritation in his eyes, before he smirked. "Tall, wearing a black coat, seen near the scene. The defendant is tall. He was wearing a black coat that night. That's all we need to know, isn't it?" Madeline didn't flinch. "So, by that logic, anyone tall wearing a black coat in the vicinity is a murderer?" Several jurors exchanged glances. Madeline moved to the defense table, resting a hand on the case file. "There's a bigger problem here," she continued. "There are no fingerprints, no physical evidence, no clear identification. No one actually saw Daniel Carter commit this crime. And, more importantly, there was one witness who saw someone else fleeing the scene. But the police ignored that statement. Gavin's brow arched. And who exactly is this so-called witness? Madeline smiled. A homeless man who was near the store that night. But, of course, who wants to listen to a witness with no permanent address, right? A shift rippled through the courtroom, uncertainty creeping into the jurors' expressions. Katherine could feel it, too. Madeline was right. And if Daniel wasn't the killer, then who was? The tension in the courtroom thickened as Madeline Grant continued her argument. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "we have a witness who saw someone else fleeing the crime scene on the night of the murder. But there's a serious problem." The police ignored his statement. Her words sent a ripple through the jury. Gavin Brooks, the prosecutor, narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated. "And who is this witness?" Gavin folded his arms across his chest. Madeline stepped to her table, picked up a file, and held it up. "His name is Henry Wallace, a homeless man who lived near the pawn shop. He told police that on the night of the murder, he saw a smaller-built man running away from the store, someone noticeably shorter than the defendant. But instead of recording his statement, the police dismissed him simply because he didn't have a permanent address." One of the jurors frowned. "Is Mr. Wallace present today?" someone asked. Madeline nodded. "Yes, though, for some reason, he wasn't included on the prosecution's witness list. I had to track him down myself." Gavin scowled, but before he could interject, Judge Katherine Monroe's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "I want to hear this witness's testimony." A moment later, the courtroom doors opened. An elderly man shuffled inside, thin, with graying hair, wearing tattered clothes that barely shielded him from a cold. He looked nervous, but held a surprising sharpness in his eyes. "This is Mr. Henry Wallace," Madeline introduced. Then, turning to him, she asked, "Mr. Wallace, could you tell the court what you saw that night?" The old man cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Daniel Carter before addressing the jury. "I sleep in the alley behind Miller's pawn shop," he began slowly. "That night, I was gathering my things when I heard yelling inside. A minute later, I saw a man, smaller than the defendant, running out of the store. He looked scared. The jury listened in silence. "Did you get a clear look at his face?" Madeline asked. Wallace shook his head. "Not exactly, but I can tell you this. He was much shorter than this man." He motioned toward Daniel, and he wasn't wearing a black coat. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Katherine shifted her gaze toward Gavin. His grip tightened on his files, his jaw visibly clenched. Finally, he spoke. "But you can't confirm the identity of the person you saw, can you? Couldn't it have been just another passerby?" Wallace's eyes hardened. "I know what I saw, and I know the police ignored me." Madeline turned back to the jury, pressing forward. "Now, let's discuss the prosecution's so-called key evidence, the black coat." She placed another folder onto the table, opening it to reveal crime scene photographs. The prosecution claims the defendant was wearing this coat at the time of the murder. But here's what they didn't tell you. The coat wasn't found at the crime scene. It was discovered in a trash bin 5 blocks away. Gavin immediately stood. Of course, he threw it away to get rid of the evidence. Madeline smirked, as if she had been waiting for that exact response. "Then let's allow science to weigh in," she said, lifting a document. Forensic analysis found no fingerprints belonging to the defendant on the coat. If he wore it, if he disposed of it, why weren't his prints on it? A murmur spread through the jury. All eyes turned to Daniel Carter. But his expression remained unchanged, calm, silent, unreadable. Katherine felt an unsettling uncertainty creep in. If he was innocent, why wasn't he saying anything? She fixed her gaze on him, trying to decipher the man before her. "Defendant, do you have an alibi?" she asked, her voice firm. Daniel met her stare, his eyes cold and distant. A long pause. Then he shook his head slightly. "I didn't kill him." Just 4 words. No explanation. No defense. No plea. A shiver ran down Katherine's spine. She couldn't read him. She didn't understand him. Gavin seized the moment, rising with a smug half-smile. "Your Honor, the truth is obvious. If the defendant were truly innocent, why wouldn't he defend himself? An innocent man wouldn't just stay silent." The jury nodded slightly, swayed by the logic. Madeline clenched her jaw. She knew silence in a criminal trial could be deadly. It left room for doubt, for fear, for assumptions. Katherine studied Daniel once more. What was he hiding? She didn't have the answer, but she knew one thing for certain. This case was far from over. Judge Katherine Monroe had presided over hundreds of cases, but none had ever left her with a feeling quite like this, a sense that something was being deliberately hidden. When the court adjourned for recess, she returned to her office, closed the door, and requested her assistant to bring her every file related to the case. That night, alone in her quiet office, she pored over the documents again. She reread every witness statement, compared reports, and scrutinized every detail. Something felt off, and then she found it. A small, overlooked note in the forensic report on the victim, George Miller. Miller, the pawn shop owner, had previously been under investigation for illegal arms dealing. Katherine's brow furrowed. Why wasn't this mentioned in court? Digging deeper, she uncovered something far more alarming. George Miller wasn't just an ordinary pawn shop owner. He had ties to an underground weapons smuggling operation, one that had been active in New Orleans for years. Why hadn't the prosecution mentioned this? Why hadn't the police investigated further? The more she read, the clearer it became. Someone wanted this case to stay simple. A robbery gone wrong. A petty thief. An open-and-shut case. But it wasn't. Something was being covered up. The missing pieces. Katherine's mind raced as she compared police reports and forensic files. The inconsistencies were glaring. The autopsy report. Miller had been stabbed twice in the heart. A precise and deliberate killing. This wasn't the work of a panicked thief during a botched robbery. It was an execution. The pawn shop's safe, left completely untouched. Why would a robber take only the cash register money, but leave his safe likely holding more? Henry Wallace's testimony. A smaller-built man was seen fleeing the crime scene. Yet the police ignored this crucial detail. Had they been incompetent, or had they been told to look the other way? Katherine felt a chill crawl up her spine. There were no answers in the official files, because someone didn't want there to be. The name that changed everything. She kept digging, flipping through old reports on Miller's past, searching for any possible connections. Then she found a name. Vincent Lorne. Who was Vincent Lorne? A quick search revealed everything she needed to know. Vincent Lorne wasn't just anyone. He was one of the most powerful figures in New Orleans' criminal underworld. A kingpin controlling the region's illegal arms trade. A man with deep ties to high-ranking officials, law enforcement, and even the judicial system. And the most damning revelation? George Miller had worked for him. Katherine exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the report. This wasn't a random crime. Miller hadn't just been a robbery victim. He had likely been silenced. The real question, if Daniel Carter wasn't the killer, who was? And more importantly, who wanted him to take the fall? Katherine's pulse quickened. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had enough power to ensure that. The police overlooked crucial evidence. The prosecution ignored key details. The trial focused only on Daniel Carter. Why? Was Carter just a convenient scapegoat? Or was he involved in something deeper than he was letting on? Katherine inhaled sharply. She needed answers, and she needed them before it was too late. The dangerous path ahead. As she sat in her dimly lit office, staring at the name Vincent Lorne, a chilling thought crept into her mind. If she kept digging, would she become the next target? Katherine couldn't sit still any longer. After piecing together the missing fragments of the case, she knew she needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was Daniel Carter. Ignoring the scrutinizing gazes of the prison guards, she strode into the dimly lit interrogation room. The cold metal chair scraped against the floor as she sat down, facing the man who had been the center of this entire storm. Daniel sat still, his wrists cuffed to the metal table. The flickering fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across his face. He didn't look up when she entered. Katherine drummed her fingers against the tabletop, breaking the tense silence. "We need to talk." A dry chuckle escaped Daniel's lips, his gaze still locked on the table. A judge having a private conversation with a defendant, not afraid of breaking the rules. Katherine met his sarcasm head-on. If you cared about rules, you would have defended yourself in court. She leaned in slightly. I'm not here for games, Carter. I want the truth. For a moment, Daniel remained silent. Then, finally, he looked up. His eyes were the same as before, deep, unreadable, and haunted. I didn't kill George Miller. His voice was steady. Katherine folded her arms, studying him. I believe you. For the first time, surprise flashed across his face. Then why am I still in here? Because you won't talk. Katherine's voice dropped lower. Asterisk, asterisk. I know this case isn't what it seems. I know George Miller was tied to an illegal arms ring. I know the police ignored key evidence. And I know, she locked eyes with him, that you're hiding something. Daniel held her gaze, his expression unreadable. You were near the scene that night, she pressed on. But you weren't the killer. The question is, what did you see? The silence in the room became suffocating. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. The metal cuffs clinked as his fingers curled into fists. Then, finally, he spoke. If I tell you, I'm dead. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Katherine's chest tightened. Who's behind this? She asked, her voice unwavering. Daniel shook his head, and for the first time, Katherine saw something she hadn't seen in him before, fear. Real, unfiltered fear. I can't. Katherine clenched her fists on the table. If you don't, they win. They'll throw you in prison for a murder you didn't commit. And when that door shuts behind you, no one will care if you were innocent. Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. And you think if I talk, I'll make it out alive? Katherine leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I won't let them kill you. A long silence. Then, Daniel moved forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper, so quiet only she could hear. I know who killed George Miller. Katherine's pulse thundered in her ears. She swallowed hard. Who? Daniel studied her carefully. Then he said a name. Katherine's blood ran cold. She knew that name. And if Daniel was telling the truth, this case was darker than she had ever imagined. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Every gaze fixed on Daniel Carter, the silent defendant, the man everyone assumed was guilty. But today, everything was about to change. Madeline Grant strode forward, her confidence unwavering. She set a thick folder on the defense table, flipping through its pages before turning to face the jury. Your Honor, we have a serious issue that must be addressed. Across the room, Prosecutor Gavin Brooks stiffened, though he tried to mask his irritation. Ms. Grant, he said, his voice smooth but tight, if this is another attempt to discredit this case, I prefer we not waste the court's time. Madeline's lips curled into a small smirk. Oh, then let me ask you this. Do you recall the witness, Henry Wallace? Gavin cast a brief glance at the jury before answering evenly. You mean the homeless man the defense tried to use as a distraction? Madeline's expression sharpened. No, I mean the only witness who saw someone else flee the crime scene. And I have proof that the police intentionally ignored his testimony. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Madeline lifted a red folder. This is the original police interrogation report. She pulled out another document. And this is the official version submitted to the court. She paused, letting the jury take in the glaring discrepancies. Why are these reports different? She continued. Henry Wallace originally stated that he saw a smaller-built man running from the pawn shop in a panic. But in the final police report, that crucial detail was erased. Gavin's jaw tightened. This proves nothing, he said, voice clipped. It could have been a clerical error. Really? Madeline cut in. Then how do you explain the deleted surveillance footage? A sudden silence. For the first time, Gavin hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about. Madeline let out a knowing smile. Then let's watch it together. The courtroom lights dimmed as a new video played on the large screen. This wasn't the same grainy footage the prosecution had shown before. This was different. The previous footage had shown a tall man in a black coat entering the store. But now, the camera angle was from the back exit, one the police hadn't included in evidence. The room held its breath as the events unfolded. 2 minutes after the black-coated figure entered, another man burst out the back door. Smaller, faster, wearing a gray hoodie. As he fled down the alley, he lifted his arm, just enough for the camera to catch something unmistakable. A tattoo, a snake coiled around a gun, the mark of one of the city's most dangerous arms-dealing gangs. The courtroom erupted. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. The prosecution's case was crumbling. Madeline turned sharply toward Gavin. "Mr. Brooks, would you care to explain why this footage was not included in the official case file?" All eyes were on him. Gavin's mask slipped. He clenched his fists, struggling for control before finally responding. "I had no knowledge of this footage." A weak answer, and no one believed him. Madeline turned back to the jury, her voice commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer just about one man on trial. This is about a system that has failed to uphold the truth." A key witness was ignored. A vital piece of evidence was buried. And an innocent man was branded a murderer because of his past. Jurors nodded, their expressions shifting. For the first time, Daniel Carter lifted his head. And in his eyes, Katherine saw something she hadn't before. Hope. Katherine folded her hands on the bench, the weight of the moment settling in. The truth was finally emerging. But the fight wasn't over. Because whoever had buried that evidence, whoever had tried to frame Daniel, was still out there. And they wouldn't go down without a fight. The sharp crack of Katherine's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom. A heavy silence fell over the room as the jury filed back in, their expressions unreadable after hours of deliberation. A woman, elderly, poised, stood as the jury foreperson, holding a folded sheet of paper in trembling hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Daniel Carter, the entire courtroom held its breath. Daniel sat still, his hands resting on the table, expressionless, unmoving. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The pause stretched unbearably long. "Not guilty." The room exploded. Cheers, shouts, gasps of relief. Some applauded, others cursed under their breath. Reporters scrambled to document the moment, cameras flashing wildly. On the prosecution's side, Gavin Brooks sat frozen, his face drained of color. He knew this wasn't just a loss. It was a career-ending failure. Across the courtroom, Daniel barely reacted. He tilted his head slightly, but showed no sign of celebration. This wasn't a victory. It was simply a step out of the hell he had been forced into. Katherine studied him from the bench. She should have felt relief. She had upheld the law. She had ensured an innocent man was not convicted. But this wasn't justice, because the real mastermind behind this case was still free. And Daniel knew it. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm orange glow over the courthouse steps. Daniel stepped through the heavy doors, his first breath of freedom feeling strangely hollow. Katherine stood waiting near the entrance, arms crossed, watching him closely. He stopped, their eyes meeting. For the first time since this trial began, he smiled. Just barely. "So, you finally believed me?" His voice was low, rough. Katherine tilted her head slightly. "I didn't just believe you. I did what should have been done a long time ago." Daniel nodded, as if weighing her words. A cold breeze swept between them, carrying the distant hum of New Orleans traffic. Then, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and pressed it into her hand. Katherine frowned, opening it. An address. Her eyes snapped back to Daniel, but he had already turned away. "What is this?" she called after him. He paused for only a second, voice quiet but deliberate. "The truth you're looking for." And then, he walked away. His silhouette melted into the city lights, swallowed by the streets. Katherine stood there, gripping the slip of paper. A hollow ache settled in her chest. She had a choice. If she walked away, the case would end here. Daniel was free. The jury had spoken. She had done her job as a judge. But if she followed this address, she would be diving deeper into something far more dangerous than any courtroom battle. The real killer was still out there. The real conspiracy had yet to be unraveled, and Daniel had just given her a chance to end it. Katherine inhaled deeply. Then, with newfound resolve, she took a step forward toward the address. Because justice wasn't just about verdicts in a courtroom. Justice was about the truth. And she wouldn't stop until she found it.